The old Pacific big boy train refused to move until an old wartime driver stepped forward. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get to the story. The engineers stood still as the mighty Pacific big boy locomotive slowly roared to life, its engine humming with a power they had thought was lost. Henry, the old wartime driver, stood quietly at the side, his worn hands still gripping the wrench he had used to fix the machine. The young engineers had never seen anything like it. They had fought against this giant for hours, and yet it took a man with years of experience to bring it back to life. The moment was a turning point for them, a reminder of the power of experience and knowledge over modern technology. But as the train began to move, a sense of uncertainty still hung in the air. Could it really be that simple? Had they missed something all along? Mike, the technician who had initially mocked Henry, approached him cautiously. His face was red with a mixture of frustration and awe. "I don't get it," Mike said, his voice low. "How did you do that? The computers didn't catch it, but you did." Henry gave a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes, the answer is right in front of you. You just have to know where to look." The words hung in the air as the big boy train chugged forward, its massive wheels turning on the tracks once again. The engineers watched as it pulled away, still in disbelief that it had been revived so effortlessly. "You sure you're not a magician?" Mike asked, shaking his head. Henry chuckled, his eyes twinkling with quiet pride. "No magic, son. Just experience." The young engineers were silent for a moment, contemplating his words. They had relied so heavily on technology, on their fancy tools and diagnostics, that they had forgotten the importance of hands-on knowledge. Henry, with his years of wisdom, had shown them something they would never forget. As the train rumbled on, the sound of its engines slowly faded into the distance. The crew stood together in the yard, a newfound respect for their craft blooming in their hearts. They had learned an invaluable lesson that day, one that couldn't be taught in a classroom or by a machine. It was something that only time could provide. As the last echoes of the big boy faded away, the engineers knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not because of the train itself, but because of the man who had revived it. The old wartime driver had given them a glimpse of the past, a reminder of the old ways that still had value. They would never forget the lesson he had taught them. And as for Henry, he simply watched the train go, his thoughts distant, yet content. His work was done. The big boy was moving again, and that was all that mattered. As the Pacific big boy locomotive rolled smoothly down the tracks, the engineers stood at the yard's edge, still reeling from the sheer power of what had just happened. Henry, the old wartime driver, was now standing off to the side, quietly observing the locomotive's progress. His hands, which had once repaired engines in the heat of battle, were now still, resting at his sides. He had proven a point, not just about machines, but about the value of experience, a lesson they would never forget. Mike, the technician who had been the most skeptical, could hardly look Henry in the eye. His hands were still shaking slightly, not from the effort of repairing the train, but from the realization that a man with decades of experience had done something they could not, despite their advanced technology. Mike had spent years working with the latest tools, but in just a few minutes, Henry had shown him that some things could not be replaced by gadgets or software. The older man, with his quiet strength, had cracked open a door to the past that Mike didn't even know was there. "You know, I thought we had everything figured out," Mike said after a long silence. "But you—" He trailed off, struggling to find the right words. Henry gave him a knowing look. "It's not about the tools, son. It's about the knowledge. You can have all the fancy equipment in the world, but nothing replaces experience." Mike nodded, finally understanding. He watched Henry as the old man gave the big boy a final once-over before turning to walk away. "You've got a lot to teach us, don't you?" Mike said, following him. Henry didn't answer at first. He just kept walking, his pace steady and calm, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. "Experience doesn't make you a teacher," Henry said quietly. "It just gives you the chance to show others something they don't know yet." As the train moved down the tracks, The engineers and crew watched it disappear into the distance. For a moment, no one spoke. There was something profoundly humbling about the sight of the big boy chugging away, effortlessly, as if it had never faltered. The engineers had been fixated on the latest tech, their eyes glued to monitors and diagnostic screens, but Henry had done something that all their gadgets couldn't. He had listened to the machine. They had been too focused on finding a specific error, missing the larger picture. They didn't see the small detail that Henry had recognized instantly, the slight misalignment that only someone who had worked with machines for years could have spotted. Henry had fixed it, not with advanced technology, but with the knowledge he had earned through decades of working with engines just like this one. Mike, still in awe, turned to his colleague, Ben, a junior technician who had been watching the entire exchange in silence. "What do you think?" Mike asked. Ben shook his head. "I think we've got a lot to learn. We spend so much time focused on the latest tools, but sometimes it's the old ways that get the job done." As the crew slowly made their way back to the workshop, their minds were racing. They had just experienced something that no amount of training could have prepared them for. They had witnessed the power of experience, the value of wisdom that only time could provide. They had learned a lesson that no classroom could teach, and it was one they would carry with them for the rest of their careers. Henry, on the other hand, was already thinking about the next job. He didn't dwell on the success of the moment. His focus was always forward, always on the next challenge. He didn't need praise or recognition. For him, the satisfaction came from doing the work, quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. As he walked off toward the parking lot, Mike caught up with him again. "Hey, Henry," he called. "You ever think about teaching? Giving back some of that knowledge." Henry looked over his shoulder, his eyes twinkling with a hint of amusement. "I've been teaching all my life, Mike," he said. "Sometimes, all you need to do is show up, listen, and fix what's broken. That's enough for me." And with that, Henry climbed into his old truck and drove off, leaving the engineers to reflect on the lesson he had imparted. The big boy train had been revived, but more importantly, a new understanding had been born, one that would change the way they approached their work forever. As the days passed, the engineers continued to work on the tracks, their minds still buzzing with the lessons they had learned from Henry. The big boy locomotive was back in action, but it was more than just the mechanical repairs that had impressed them. It was the quiet wisdom of the old man who had brought it to life. Henry had left the yard that day, his job done, and while the crew got back to work, they were forever changed. Mike, who had once dismissed Henry as nothing more than an old relic, now found himself thinking back to the day when the locomotive had come to life under Henry's hands. It was as if something deep inside the engine had awakened, just as it had inside him. "I still can't believe it," Mike said one morning as he stood at the edge of the tracks, watching the train hum along the line. "We had all the latest technology, and it still didn't work." Ben, the junior technician, nodded. He had been one of the few to really pay attention to Henry's methods. "It's about more than just the tech," Ben said. "It's about understanding what you're working with. Henry's been doing this for decades. He doesn't need a screen to tell him what's wrong." Mike turned to look at him. "I guess I've been so focused on the tools, I forgot the most important part, the experience." Ben smiled. "Exactly. It's not just about the machine. It's about knowing how it works and listening to it." For the first time in a long time, Mike found himself feeling inspired. He had always thought that technology was the answer to every problem. But after seeing Henry's approach, he realized that some things just couldn't be fixed with gadgets. The wisdom came from years of practice, of listening, and of understanding the machines as living, breathing entities. That was something no machine could replace. Days later, the team was faced with another challenge. This time, it wasn't a massive locomotive, but a smaller, less glamorous piece of machinery, an old maintenance truck that had broken down. The engineers gathered around it, ready to apply their usual methods, but something in the back of Mike's mind urged him to step back and think. The truck wasn't as complex as the big boy, but it still had its quirks. He stood there for a moment, thinking about what Henry had said. It wasn't about forcing solutions, it was about understanding the machine. "Mike," Ben's voice snapped him back to the present. "You gonna fix it?" Mike hesitated. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure. But then he remembered Henry, his calm demeanor, his quiet confidence. With a deep breath, Mike crouched down next to the truck, popping open the hood. "Let's see what we're working with." As he tinkered with the truck, he noticed small signs, subtle clues that pointed him toward the problem. It wasn't the obvious issue, like a blown fuse or a broken belt. It was a minor misalignment in the fuel injector, something that had caused the engine to sputter and stall. Mike fixed it without hesitation, his hands working with a newfound precision. As the engine roared back to life, he couldn't help but smile. He had done it. Not with fancy tools or expensive diagnostics, but with patience, focus, and the lessons he had learned from Henry. Ben, who had been watching from the side, grinned. "Nice job. Looks like you're getting the hang of it." Mike stood up and wiped his hands on his overalls. "I think I'm finally starting to understand," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. The next morning, as the sun rose over the yard, the engineers gathered around the tracks again, ready for another day of work. They were no longer the same crew they had been before. They had learned something invaluable, something that couldn't be taught in a classroom. They had learned the power of experience, the quiet wisdom that came with years of working with machines. And they had learned that sometimes, the best way to fix something wasn't by relying on the latest gadgets, but by listening to the machine, understanding its story, and letting it guide the way. Henry had given them more than just a lesson in mechanics. He had given them a lesson in life. And as they moved forward, each engineer carried that lesson with them, knowing that the real power of their work didn't lie in the tools they used, but in the knowledge and experience they brought to the table. As the days passed, the crew continued to work on the tracks, their bond growing stronger with each challenge they faced. The lessons they had learned from Henry, the old wartime driver, had shifted the way they approached their work. They were no longer just a group of engineers focused on technology. They were a team, one that understood the value of experience and the importance of listening to the machines they worked with. Mike, the technician who had once scoffed at Henry, had undergone the most significant transformation. He found himself thinking back to that moment when Henry had effortlessly brought the big boy train back to life. It wasn't just the mechanical fix that amazed him, it was the wisdom behind it. Henry had taught him that sometimes you had to trust your instincts, something that no machine could replicate. One afternoon, as the team worked on some routine maintenance, the quiet hum of the yard was interrupted by a call over the radio. The voice on the other end was urgent. "We have a situation. A freight train's blocking the main line. It's a critical load, and we need it moved immediately. The engine's stalled, and we can't get it to start." The engineers quickly gathered their tools, ready to face the problem head-on. But Mike, now more confident in his skills, paused before rushing off. He thought of Henry and how he had approached problems with patience and precision. "Hold on," he said, raising his hand to stop the others. "Let's take a step back and think this through." The team looked at him, a little puzzled. Mike had always been the one to rush into a problem, eager to fix things quickly. "What's the plan?" Ben asked, his voice full of curiosity. Mike smiled. "We need to listen. Let's go over everything, step by step, just like Henry showed us." The team followed Mike as he led them to the stalled freight train. It was a massive locomotive, its cargo a crucial shipment of supplies that couldn't be delayed. They inspected the engine, running through the diagnostic tests. The newer techs immediately started pointing to the common issues: the engine's temperature, the fuel system, and the electrical connections. But Mike, remembering Henry's approach, knelt down by the engine and placed his ear against it. For a moment, everything was still. The hum of the yard faded away as Mike focused, listening to the sounds of the machine. The others watched him in silence, unsure of what he was doing. After a few moments, Mike's face lit up with recognition. He stood up and walked over to the controls. "It's not the fuel system. It's the cooling system. There's an issue with the thermostat valve. It's preventing the engine from starting," Mike said, his voice calm but certain. The other engineers stared at him in disbelief. "How did you know that?" Ben asked, still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that Mike had figured it out without looking at the diagnostics. "I listened to it," Mike replied. "This machine is trying to tell us what's wrong. It's like Henry said, experience teaches you to hear the things that technology can't catch." With that, the team got to work, carefully inspecting and replacing the faulty thermostat valve. The job wasn't easy, and it took time, but Mike's calm demeanor and clear thinking kept everyone focused. As the sun began to set, the locomotive roared back to life. The freight train was moving again, and the crew was able to get it back on track. The engineers stood together, feeling the satisfaction of a job well done, But more importantly, they felt a deeper connection to their work. They had solved the problem, not just with their tools, but with the knowledge they had gained from their experiences. Later that night, as the crew sat in the break room, Mike reflected on how far they had come. He thought about Henry and how he had made a lasting impact on their work. He realized that the true value of their work wasn't in the machines they repaired, but in the lessons they had learned from each other. "I think we've got a lot to thank Henry for," Mike said, breaking the silence. The others nodded in agreement. "He's not just a mechanic," Ben added. "He's a mentor. He's shown us how to approach these problems in a way we never would have thought of on our own." The room grew quiet, and for a moment, the engineers simply sat in appreciation of the lesson they had learned. It wasn't just about fixing engines or moving trains. It was about understanding the value of experience, patience, and teamwork. And as they sat together, they knew they would carry those lessons with them for the rest of their careers, always remembering the old wartime driver who had taught them the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the best solution doesn't come from the tools you use, but from the knowledge you've gained over a lifetime of hard work. The crew had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the tracks, the steady hum of machines, and the tasks at hand. Yet, despite the constant flow of work, the lessons they had learned from Henry still lingered in the air, shaping their every move. Each day, they became more attuned to the nuances of the machines they worked with, their hands more confident, their minds more open to the wisdom that could only come with experience. But as the days wore on, a new challenge was on the horizon, one that would push the crew to their limits. One early morning, the yard supervisor approached the team with a concerned look. "We've got a situation," he said, his voice serious. "One of the oldest engines in the fleet is due for its first run in years, but it's been out of commission for so long, no one's sure it will even start. The company needs it moved today, and it's your team that's been chosen to get it running." The engine in question was a relic from a bygone era, a steam-powered locomotive that had long since been retired. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. They were used to modern trains and engines, not ancient machines that required more finesse than brute force. "You sure about this?" Mike asked, raising an eyebrow. "This thing hasn't run in decades." The supervisor nodded. "The company doesn't have a choice. They need it moved today." With a sigh, Mike gathered the team. "Let's take a look at it," he said. "But remember, this isn't like anything we've done before. This one's got history, and that means we need to approach it with respect." The team made their way to the old engine, parked in a far corner of the yard. The sight of the machine was striking. It was massive, with rust and wear that told the story of years spent idle. Its once shiny brass fittings had tarnished, and its wheels, though sturdy, were covered in dust. As they approached, the air was thick with the weight of its history. The crew immediately began their inspections. The newer engineers, though capable, were hesitant. They had worked on newer, more advanced machinery, but this was different. Mike, now more confident in his skills, crouched down beside the engine, his hands brushing the cold metal. "This isn't just about fixing a machine," he said, speaking to no one in particular. "This is about bringing something back to life." The team followed his lead. They examined every inch of the locomotive, checking for any signs of wear that could prevent it from starting. Henry's lessons echoed in Mike's mind. He knew they couldn't rely on diagnostics alone. They had to listen, to feel, to understand. Ben, the junior engineer, approached the engine cautiously. "You think it can be fixed?" he asked, unsure. Mike smiled. "We're not just fixing it. We're reviving it." The crew worked steadily, testing the fuel system, checking the boiler, and carefully inspecting the old piping. As they did, Mike noticed something that no one else had. A small crack in the steam valve, barely visible, but enough to cause the engine to fail. It was a tiny detail, one that modern tech might have missed. But Mike caught it, and he knew that was the key. "This is it," he said, pointing to the crack. "This is what's been holding it back." The team worked quickly to repair the valve, but even with their newfound expertise, it was still a gamble. They weren't sure if the engine would start, or if it would fall apart the moment they tried to fire it up. With everything in place, Mike stepped back. "Here goes nothing," he muttered. He pulled the lever, and for a moment, nothing happened. The crew stood still, holding their breath, waiting for any sign that the engine would respond. Then, with a loud puff of steam, the old engine came to life. The whistle blew, and the powerful sound echoed across the yard. The crew stood in awe. staring at the machine that had once been forgotten, now roaring back into action. Mike looked around at his team, his face breaking into a wide grin. "I told you," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Sometimes, all it takes is the right touch." As the locomotive slowly pulled forward, the engineers watched in silence, realizing they had just done something remarkable. It wasn't just about the machine. It was about the lessons they had learned from Henry. The respect for the past, the willingness to listen, and the understanding that experience could not be replaced by technology. They had brought the old steam engine back to life, not with the latest tools, but with a deep respect for its history and a knowledge that had been passed down through generations. That day, the crew didn't just fix a machine. They had revived a piece of history, and in doing so, they had learned something invaluable. They had learned that, sometimes, the most powerful tool of all is the wisdom gained through time. The weeks that followed the revival of the old steam engine were marked by a quiet but profound change in the yard. The engineers, once divided by their reliance on technology, now found themselves united by something far more powerful than any tool or machine. They had learned that success didn't always come from the latest gadget or most advanced software. Sometimes it came from the wisdom gained through experience. Mike, who had once questioned everything, had become the unofficial leader of the crew. His newfound respect for the old ways, combined with his understanding of modern technology, made him a valuable asset to the team. As the crew worked on various projects, Mike would often find himself reflecting on the lessons Henry had imparted. It wasn't just about fixing machines. It was about understanding them, feeling them, and respecting the years of history and knowledge that went into making them work. One afternoon, as Mike walked through the yard, he saw an unfamiliar figure standing near the edge of the tracks. The man was older, with a look of quiet determination on his face. He was examining the equipment, much like Henry had done all those weeks ago. Mike approached him cautiously. "Can I help you?" he asked. The man turned and smiled, his eyes bright with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "I was just admiring the work you've done here," the man said. "You've brought some of these machines back to life, haven't you?" Mike nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "We've done our best," he said. "It's not just about the machines, though. It's about understanding them, respecting their history. That's the key." The man chuckled. "I can see that. You've learned a lot." Mike paused, studying the man closely. "Who are you?" The man extended his hand. "I'm Jack. I used to work on these tracks. I've been around long enough to know that machines don't just break down for no reason. They have a story to tell." Mike shook his hand. "Well, it's an honor to meet you. We've been learning a lot about that. How to listen to the machines, rather than just trying to fix them with technology." Jack's eyes twinkled. "That's the spirit. Sometimes, the best fixes don't come from the most advanced equipment. They come from a little bit of patience and a lot of experience." As the two men spoke, the rest of the crew watched from a distance. They could tell there was something different about Jack. He had the same air of quiet confidence that Henry had possessed. Mike introduced Jack to the team, and the engineers immediately recognized the same wisdom in him that they had learned to appreciate in Henry. Jack was a man who had spent his life working with machines, not just fixing them, but understanding them. He had seen countless engines come and go, and he had learned over the years that no two machines were the same. "You see," Jack explained, "machines, like people, have their quirks. You can't just treat them all the same. You have to get to know them. You have to listen to their rhythms and learn how they breathe." Mike and the crew listened intently, absorbing every word. Jack's insights resonated deeply with them. They had spent so much time focused on efficiency and speed that they had forgotten the importance of patience, the kind of patience that came with years of experience. "I've always said," Jack continued, "that a machine is only as good as the person who understands it. You have to treat it with respect, not just as a tool, but as a part of the bigger picture." As the conversation continued, the crew began to see the yard in a new light. It wasn't just a place where they fixed trains and engines. It was a place where machines lived, breathed, and had their own stories to tell. They had learned the importance of listening, not just to the machines, but to each other, and to the wisdom that came from years of hands-on experience. That night, as the crew wrapped up their work for the day, Mike stood alone for a moment, looking out over the yard. The hum of the engines, the whir of the tools, the quiet bustle of the team, it all felt different now. It felt like they were part of something bigger, something more meaningful. They weren't just fixing machines. They were preserving a piece of history, one repair at a time. As Mike walked toward the break room, he thought back to Henry and the lessons he had taught them. He could still hear Henry's voice, soft but steady. It's not just about fixing things. It's about understanding them. And now, as Mike looked around at the team, he realized that Henry's lesson had truly sunk in. They had all learned to listen, to the machines, to the stories they told, and to the wisdom that only time and experience could bring. It was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their careers, and beyond that, it would become part of the legacy they were creating in the yard. They weren't just engineers anymore. They were keepers of the past, stewards of the machines that had shaped their world. And as long as they remembered that, they knew they could face any challenge that came their way. As the months passed, the yard became more than just a place of work. It became a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the crew could immerse themselves in the rhythm of machines and the wisdom that came with years of experience. Mike, Ben, and the rest of the team had grown close, not just as co-workers, but as a family united by a shared mission, to keep the trains running, but more importantly, to honor the legacy of the machines they worked on. The lessons from Henry and Jack had transformed their approach to their craft, and it showed in every piece of work they did. Their once solitary tasks were now collaborative efforts, with everyone contributing their knowledge, no matter how old or new. One morning, the team faced a new challenge. The yard was bustling with activity, and a message came through over the radio. We've got a situation with the flagship train. It's a limited edition locomotive, recently restored, and it's having major mechanical issues. We need to get it running, and we need it now. The team gathered around, their faces grim but determined. They had seen their fair share of challenges, but this one was different. The locomotive wasn't just another machine. It was a symbol, a piece of history that had been brought back to life, and it was their responsibility to make sure it didn't fail. Mike led the charge, his mind already racing through potential solutions. We've got to approach this differently, he said. This isn't about speed or fancy tools. This is about understanding every inch of this machine, just like we did with the big boy. The crew set to work immediately, but as they began their inspection, they realized the situation was more complex than they had anticipated. The locomotive was a modern marvel, with advanced technology, but it had been restored using original parts that were decades old. It was a delicate balance between the old and the new, and no one was quite sure what was causing the malfunction. Mike knelt down next to the engine, listening closely to its hum, just like Henry had taught him. The crew watched as he leaned in, his face focused. He wasn't just looking at the diagnostics. He was listening to the sound of the engine, feeling its vibrations, and letting it tell him what was wrong. It's the regulator, Mike said after a moment, his voice steady. The system isn't getting the right pressure, and that's throwing everything off. We need to reset it, but carefully. Too much pressure, and we'll blow the whole system. The others were skeptical. The locomotive was one of the most advanced machines they had ever worked on, and Mike's solution sounded too simple. Are you sure? Ben asked. That doesn't sound like the issue. It's a high-tech system. Mike smiled. It's always the simple things that get overlooked. Trust me. The team worked together to carefully adjust the regulator, making sure everything was calibrated just right. As they did, they could feel the tension building in the air. It was a race against time. If they didn't fix it soon, the entire operation would be delayed. Once the adjustments were made, Mike took a deep breath. Here goes nothing, he said. He flipped the switch, and for a moment, nothing happened. The crew stood still, waiting for any sign of life from the locomotive. Then, with a low rumble, the engine roared to life. The sound of the locomotive echoed across the yard, a deep, powerful hum that made everyone breathe a sigh of relief. The crew erupted into applause, their faces lighting up with pride. Well done, Mike, Ben said, his voice full of admiration. You were right. It was the regulator. Mike smiled. Sometimes, you just have to listen. It's not always about what you see. Sometimes, it's about what you feel. As the locomotive slowly began to move, the crew watched in awe. They had done it again. They had saved another piece of history, and this time, they had done it with the same quiet understanding that had gotten them through so many challenges before. But this time, something had changed. They had worked together as a true team, each one bringing something valuable to the table, each one learning from the other. Mike stood back, watching the train glide down the tracks. He knew that the lessons they had learned, the lessons from Henry, Jack, and their own experiences, would stay with them for the rest of their careers. They were no longer just engineers. They were keepers of the past, protectors of the machines that had built the foundation of the world they lived in. And as they watched the locomotive disappear into the distance, Mike felt a deep sense of pride. This was more than just fixing machines. This was about understanding the history that lay behind them, respecting the legacy that had brought them to this point, and passing that knowledge on to the next generation of engineers. As the crew gathered to pack up for the day, Mike looked around at his team, his family, and realized that they had become something greater than the sum of their parts. They were not just repairing engines, they were preserving history. And that was something worth fighting for. It had been weeks since the flagship locomotive was successfully restarted, and the yard had returned to its usual rhythm. But something was different now. The crew, once relying solely on their technology, had become more aware of the heart of the machines they worked with. They had learned that it wasn't just about the tools or the diagnostics. It was about knowing the machine, listening to it, and respecting the history it carried. Mike had grown into a confident leader, and the team followed his example, tackling challenges with a sense of unity and purpose. One morning, a new challenge arrived. The yard supervisor called the team to attention, his voice tight with concern. "We've got a problem with one of the most crucial trains on the route," he said. "It's the high-speed passenger train, the one scheduled for the big intercity launch. It's been running fine, but now, it's showing some issues that could affect the entire schedule." The urgency in his voice was undeniable. Mike and the crew knew that this train wasn't just a machine, it was a lifeline for the city. They had to get it back on track. Without hesitation, Mike gathered the team. "We're not going to rush this one," he said. "We've learned that sometimes, it's not about the speed of the fix. It's about precision and understanding. Let's take a good look at it, step by step, and listen to what it's telling us." The team made their way to the high-speed train, parked in a quiet corner of the yard. It was sleek, fast, and powerful, a far cry from the older steam engines they had worked on before. This was a machine built for speed and efficiency, with advanced systems and diagnostics that were well beyond the trains of the past. As they inspected the train, the engineers quickly identified the problem. The engine was overheating, but no alerts had been triggered. The system seemed fine, but the temperature gauge was dangerously high. The crew started running through the possible causes. The cooling system, the exhaust, the electronics, everything checked out on the diagnostic screen. "It doesn't make sense," Ben said, his brow furrowed as he tapped away at the system controls. "Everything is running within normal parameters. Why is it overheating?" Mike stood back, his eyes scanning the train, looking not at the screens, but at the machinery itself. He thought of Henry and Jack, both men who had taught him to listen to the machines. He stepped closer to the engine, placing his hand on the cooling system. "It's the airflow," Mike said, his voice calm but sure. "This system is designed to work with a certain level of airflow, but something's blocking it. It's subtle, but it's there." The crew looked at him, unsure. "How do you know?" Ben asked, still unconvinced. Mike smiled. "I'm not guessing. I'm listening." The others watched in silence as Mike opened a panel and carefully checked the filters and vents. Sure enough, he found a small obstruction in one of the cooling ducts. It was something small, something that could easily be missed, but it was enough to disrupt the airflow and cause the engine to overheat. "That's the problem," Mike said. "It's just a tiny blockage, but it's enough to throw the whole system off." With a few quick adjustments, the team cleared the obstruction, and the cooling system was back to normal. The engine fired up again, this time without any issues. The crew stood back, watching as the train slowly rolled down the tracks. It wasn't just the fix that mattered. It was how they had approached the problem. They hadn't relied on technology alone. They had used their skills, their experience, and most importantly, they had listened. As the train moved smoothly down the track, Mike felt a sense of pride wash over him. It wasn't just about solving the problem. It was about how they had worked together to understand the problem in the first place. And for the first time, he realized something important. They had become more than just a team of engineers. They had become keepers of knowledge, protectors of the machines that powered the city. Later that day, the supervisor came by, his face full of relief. "You did it," he said. "The train is ready, and we're back on schedule." Mike nodded, but he knew that the credit wasn't his alone. It was the team, the lessons they had learned, and the wisdom they had gained from the machines and the men who had come before them. It's not just about fixing things, Mike said quietly. It's about understanding them. The supervisor raised an eyebrow. Understanding them? Yeah, Mike said, his eyes shining with newfound clarity. When you listen, when you really pay attention, you can fix almost anything. As the day came to a close and the sun set over the yard, Mike stood at the edge of the tracks, watching the train disappear into the distance. He knew that the journey they had started wasn't just about machines or trains. It was about the legacy they were creating, one repair at a time. They weren't just engineers. They were the storytellers of the machines, the ones who would preserve their histories for generations to come. It had been a few weeks since the high-speed passenger train had been successfully restored to full function. The crew was still riding the wave of pride from their latest success, but now, the atmosphere in the yard had shifted. There was an unspoken understanding between them that they were not just fixing machines, they were preserving history. The old methods, the wisdom passed down from Henry and Jack, had proven time and again that true knowledge didn't lie in the latest technology, but in the lessons learned over years of experience. As the crew prepared for another day of work, a new challenge emerged. The yard supervisor arrived with an urgent message. "We've got a crisis on our hands," he said, his tone serious. "The maintenance system is down. The automated system is giving us false readings, and it's affecting the whole fleet. We need it up and running by the end of the day, or we risk delays that could set us back for weeks." The pressure was on. Mike and the team exchanged concerned glances. They were used to fixing engines, but this was a different kind of challenge. This wasn't about mechanical failure. It was about a system that was supposed to make their lives easier, but now, it was making everything more complicated. "All right," Mike said, standing tall. "We've done this before. It's not about relying on what's in front of us, but on what we know. Let's get to work." The team gathered around, ready to tackle the problem. The automated maintenance system was supposed to simplify their tasks, but now, it was malfunctioning, sending false reports about the condition of the engines. The team began running diagnostics on the system, their eyes glued to the screens as the system flashed error messages. But Mike stood back, his mind working differently than the others. He was no longer looking at the diagnostics or the machines. He was looking at the bigger picture. This system was designed to help us, but it's only as good as the person who understands it, Mike said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's break it down, step by step, and see where it's failing." The crew hesitated. They had grown used to relying on the automated systems to guide their decisions. The idea of manually inspecting the system seemed outdated. But Mike had a point. The system was giving them faulty information, and they needed to trust their instincts. As they worked together, they realized that the issue wasn't with the technology itself, it was the way it had been integrated. The automated system was simply a tool, and like any tool, it needed to be used properly. The team began identifying small discrepancies in the system's data, things that the automated system had overlooked. They corrected the error in the software, recalibrated the sensors, and restored the integrity of the system. It was a slow process, but as the day wore on, the system began to stabilize. By late afternoon, the maintenance system was fully operational again. The crew had done it, not by relying on the technology, but by using their knowledge and experience to understand how it worked. As they stood back and watched the system come to life once more, the sense of accomplishment was palpable. "We did it," Ben said, his voice filled with awe. "We fixed it, and we didn't even need to rely on the system." Mike smiled. "Sometimes, you have to remember that no machine, no matter how advanced, can replace the knowledge that comes from years of experience." As the crew finished up their work for the day, Mike found himself reflecting on how far they had come. They had learned to trust themselves, to trust their instincts, and to work as a team. They had learned the value of experience and the importance of not just using technology, but understanding it. And as they stood together, watching the sun set over the yard, Mike realized that they were no longer just engineers. They were stewards of the past, protectors of the machines that had shaped the world they lived in. They weren't just fixing things, they were preserving history, one repair at a time. The lesson they had learned that day would stay with them forever. Technology could fail, but the knowledge and wisdom they had accumulated over the years would always be their greatest asset. The success with the automated maintenance system had given the crew a renewed sense of confidence. But it didn't take long for another challenge to present itself. This time, it came in the form of an urgent request from the operations department. The newest addition to their fleet, an experimental electric locomotive, had stalled on the main line, and the entire transit schedule was being held up. The problem wasn't just mechanical. It was the first real test of the new technology, and if they couldn't fix it, it would be a huge setback for the company. The pressure was on. The crew, now accustomed to the rhythm of high-pressure situations, gathered in the break room. Mike could see the uncertainty in their eyes. This was different. This wasn't about a standard repair job. It was about the future of the fleet, and failure wasn't an option. "All right," Mike said, his voice calm and steady. "We've worked on machines of all kinds. We've learned from the past, and now we're going to use that to fix this." The team followed him out to the tracks where the electric locomotive sat, its sleek, modern design standing in stark contrast to the older machines they were used to. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the train itself was hesitant to even start. The engineers circled around it, eyes scanning for any signs of damage. The system was unlike anything they had ever worked on before. There were no gears to inspect, no pistons to check. It was all electrical and digital, a world that felt foreign to the crew. "This isn't like anything we've dealt with," Ben said, his voice tinged with doubt. "I mean, look at it. It's all wires and screens. Where do we even start?" Mike glanced at the locomotive. "We start the same way we always do," he said. "By listening." The team looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean, listen?" asked another engineer. Mike smiled slightly. "Just because it's high-tech doesn't mean it doesn't have a story. Every machine speaks to you in its own way. You just have to know how to listen." With that, Mike began to examine the locomotive's digital display, tapping the screen lightly. The rest of the crew hovered behind him, watching his every move. He wasn't just reading the error codes. He was studying the patterns, noticing things that others might have missed. He reached out and adjusted a few settings, then turned the dial on the control panel. The screen flashed, showing a warning message. "It's the battery," Mike said, pointing to the display. "The energy storage system is misaligned. The charge isn't flowing properly." Ben frowned. "But that's a brand new system, isn't it? It should be fine." "New doesn't always mean perfect," Mike replied. "We'll have to manually recalibrate the system and reroute the power. It's not as complicated as it seems, but it will take precision." The team set to work, following Mike's instructions as he carefully guided them through the process. They recalibrated the energy storage system, checked the wiring connections, and adjusted the power flow to the engine. It wasn't fast work. They had to be meticulous, ensuring that every step was done with care. As they worked, Mike kept thinking about the lesson Henry had taught him so long ago. It wasn't just about fixing the problem. It was about understanding the machine, respecting it, and taking the time to learn what it needed. After what felt like hours of careful adjustments, Mike stepped back and looked at the locomotive. "Let's see if it works," he said, his voice calm but full of anticipation. He pushed the button to power up the system. The screens flashed to life, and for a moment, nothing happened. The crew held their breath. Then, with a hum, the locomotive powered up. The engine came to life with a smooth purr, the digital systems running perfectly. The locomotive had been revived. The crew cheered, their faces lighting up with pride. They had done it. Not because of their advanced equipment, but because of the knowledge they had gained from years of working with machines. They had listened. As the locomotive slowly began to move, Mike felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had saved the day, and in doing so, they had learned a valuable lesson. That no matter how advanced technology became, it was always the people behind it, the ones who understood the machines, who made the real difference. As the team watched the locomotive roll down the tracks, they knew they had not just solved a problem. They had proven that experience and patience were still the most valuable tools they had. They weren't just fixing machines. They were helping shape the future of transportation, one repair at a time. The crew had gained a newfound confidence in their abilities, and the challenges they had faced had only strengthened their resolve. They had tackled everything from old steam engines to high-tech electric locomotives, each time learning something new and valuable. But as they entered the final stretch of the year, a new, more personal challenge awaited them. One that would test not only their skills, but their integrity. The message came through in the middle of a busy afternoon. It was from the yard supervisor, and it was unlike any request they had received before. "We've got a problem," The supervisor's voice crackled over the intercom. The company has just made a deal to sell one of our oldest and most valuable locomotives to a collector. It's the original prototype from the 1950s, the first model in the entire fleet. The only problem is, it hasn't run in years. We need you to get it operational again. Mike's heart sank. The locomotive in question was a relic, a true piece of history. It had been out of commission for over a decade, and no one had even tried to start it in years. The idea of restoring it felt impossible, but there was no way they could turn down the request. This is going to be a big one, Mike said, turning to the team. But we've handled tough situations before. We've brought machines back from the brink, and we'll do it again. The crew gathered around the locomotive, parked in a secluded part of the yard. It was a sight to behold, massive and imposing, with steel and chrome that had once gleamed brightly, but now were tarnished with time. The locomotive's rusted body and forgotten engine seemed to tell the story of a time when the world was simpler, when these machines were the lifeblood of transportation. As the crew approached, they could feel the weight of its history pressing down on them. This wasn't just another job, it was a chance to preserve a piece of that history. All right, Mike said, his voice steady. Let's do this right. We're not just fixing a machine. We're bringing back a piece of the past. The crew set to work. They began by checking the basics: fuel, engine fluids, and electrical connections. Everything seemed to be in order, but the engine still wouldn't turn over. The diagnostic equipment showed nothing but error messages. This isn't like anything we've ever dealt with, Ben said, frustration creeping into his voice. This machine's too old. Nothing's working. Mike stood back, his arms crossed, taking in the situation. He could feel the same sense of doubt creeping in, but he refused to let it take hold. They had faced impossible odds before, and they would do it again. This isn't about modern technology, Mike said, his voice calm but firm. We're going to have to listen to it. Let's take our time and figure out what it needs. The team followed his lead, carefully inspecting the engine and listening to the subtle sounds it made. Mike's experience had taught him to hear things others couldn't, to read the language of the machines. After hours of examining every inch of the locomotive, they found the issue: a clogged fuel injector that had been left untreated for years. It was a small problem, but one that had kept the engine from starting. This is it, Mike said, pointing to the clogged injector. This is what's been holding it back. The team worked quickly to fix the issue, but they knew the hardest part was yet to come. The locomotive still needed to be tested. As they connected the power, the crew held their breath. Would it work? Would the old machine come to life again, or would they fail? Mike reached for the controls, his hands steady despite the pressure. He flicked the switch, and for a moment, nothing happened. The crew waited, eyes fixed on the locomotive. Then, with a shudder and a deep growl, the engine roared to life. The sound filled the yard, a powerful, triumphant noise that seemed to reverberate through the air. The locomotive was running. The crew cheered, their faces lighting up with pride. They had done it. They had brought the old locomotive back to life, not with the latest tools, but with the lessons they had learned over the years. We did it, Ben said, his voice filled with disbelief. It actually worked. Mike smiled, his eyes shining with pride. It worked because we listened. This wasn't about fancy diagnostics. It was about understanding the machine, feeling its pulse, and respecting its history. As the locomotive began to roll down the track, the crew watched in silence, each of them, reflecting on what they had just accomplished. They hadn't just fixed an old machine. They had preserved a piece of history. And in doing so, they had learned something invaluable: that no matter how far technology advances, there will always be a place for experience, for understanding, and for listening to the stories machines have to tell. That day, the crew didn't just fix a locomotive. They gave it a new life, and in doing so, they ensured that the past would never be forgotten. As the crew watched the locomotive glide down the tracks, the sense of accomplishment was palpable. The machine that had once seemed like an impossible challenge was now alive and moving, a testament to their skill, teamwork, and determination. It wasn't just a victory over a machine, it was a victory over doubt and uncertainty. They had not only repaired the locomotive, they had revived a piece of history, and in doing so, they had strengthened the bond that had formed among them. Mike stood at the edge of the yard, watching the train disappear into the distance, his mind reflecting on the journey they had taken. It wasn't just about fixing machines, it was about understanding them, respecting them, and learning from them. They had learned that the true power of their work didn't lie in the tools they used or the technology at their disposal. It lay in their ability to listen, to learn, and to adapt. As he turned back to the yard, Mike saw the rest of the crew gathered around the workshop, talking animatedly. They were no longer just technicians. They were a team, a family, bound together by the experiences they had shared. He walked over to join them, his heart full of pride. "You all did great," Mike said, his voice steady. "We did something incredible today, not just for the company, but for ourselves. We've learned more than just how to fix engines. We've learned how to bring something back to life, how to preserve its story." Ben, who had come a long way since the early days, nodded in agreement. "It's amazing how far we've come. I used to think machines were just machines, but now, I see that they have a story to tell. We just have to listen to it." The crew fell silent for a moment, each of them reflecting on what they had learned. It wasn't just about fixing a single locomotive. It was about the lessons they had gained along the way, the wisdom that had been passed down through generations, and the knowledge that they would carry forward into every future challenge. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Mike took a deep breath. He knew that this was the moment when everything had changed. They weren't just a crew anymore. They were a team that understood the value of history, the importance of experience, and the power of collaboration. And as they stood together, watching the train disappear into the horizon, Mike felt a sense of peace. They had done something special. They had ensured that the legacy of the machines they worked on would continue, not just through repairs, but through understanding. The world might change, and the machines might grow more advanced, but there would always be a place for those who understood the past, who respected it, and who used it to build a better future. Mike knew that the future of the yard, and of the company, was in good hands. They had learned the most important lesson of all, that it wasn't just about the machines. It was about the people who worked on them, who gave them life, who preserved their stories, and who ensured that the past would never be forgotten. As the crew dispersed for the evening, Mike took one last look at the yard. It had been a long road, filled with challenges and triumphs, but it had also been a journey of growth and discovery. He knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, with the same respect, knowledge, and dedication that had gotten them this far. The story of the yard, and of the machines they worked on, was far from over. And Mike was ready for whatever came next, knowing that with this team, there was nothing they couldn't accomplish. In this emotional story, the crew of engineers faces the daunting challenge of restoring an old locomotive to its former glory. With the guidance of experienced mentors and the lessons they have learned from the past, they bring the engine back to life, overcoming obstacles and finding strength in teamwork. As they solve technical problems and restore the legacy of the machines they work on, the story reveals how experience and respect for history can transform their approach to each task. This emotional story not only celebrates their technical skills, but also highlights the deep connection they form with the machines, learning to listen to their stories and understand their needs. As the team works together, they realize that it's not just about fixing machines, but preserving history and passing on knowledge for future generations. The emotional story of the crew's journey is one of growth, determination, and respect, as they discover the true value of their work and the power of collaboration. With each successful repair, the crew becomes more united and confident, ready to face new challenges while honoring the machines and their legacy. The emotional story of their experiences in the yard unfolds, illustrating how the lessons from the past can guide them to a brighter future. In this emotional story, the crew is not just repairing engines. They are learning valuable life lessons that will stay with them forever.